Welcome to the Phoenix Effect podcast with Elle, Kristin, and Dennis. We are three narrative-trained therapists, and we will be interviewing storytellers from all walks of life. We will explore what people do to find belonging, purpose, and success. Listen in as we delve into the depths of the human experience. If you have a story you would like to tell, stay tuned to find out how to become a part of the show. Are you ready for a good story? Here we go. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Elle. Nice to be here.
Can you tell our listeners where you are in the world and what you like to do while you're there?
Yeah, so I'm in Boston, Mass right now. What do I like to do here? It's funny because I do travel a lot, especially during the winter, and I'm not a winter person, but when the weather is nice here, Boston's very walkable. There's BC football games. I went to BC, so me and my friends go to a lot of those. We watch regular football, NFL, just went to a Patriots game last weekend, and then there's a good food scene in Boston, so I like trying out different restaurants and getting to those.
Yeah, tell us the most recent one you had that just really wowed you.
Restaurant?
Yeah.
I went to this place, it was probably in like May. Not that that was the last place I went to, but in May I went to this place called Ruka. It is Peruvian Japanese. So it's almost like a sushi restaurant, but they have bows and stuff like that. They put a flair on it, some spin of I don't really even know what Peruvian cuisine is, but it just has a little bit of a different spin to it than traditional sushi. Not only was that cool from a concept standpoint, but the restaurant is beautiful. The food is unbelievable. And it was one of those where I was like, I know this place has been here for a while. How have I not been told about it? How have I not gotten here sooner?
I love it. An adventurous food eater. How was it for you to write the story that you sent over, Brian?
It was fine. There's kind of two levels. One is I write a lot, so I tend to nitpick myself. I have a process down where there are times where I'm like, oh, I need to go through the process. I need to make sure I feel good about what I wrote, as in like grammar and structure and not repeating words and whatnot. But the actual story or the content itself, like I've written that a lot of different times across my blogs and my books themselves. I'm comfortable with the story, just more kind of the grunt work of getting the actual document finished, if you will.
When you are ready to read it or tell it, we're ready.
Okay, cool. So I think I'll read it, and then if there is parts where I just want to ad lib a little bit, I may. One of those giving a class presentation. Hi, I'm Brian Suchetta, a 30-some-year-old software developer and part-time writer from Boston, Mass. Throughout my life, I've dealt with anxiety and depression, both of which have served as the driving forces behind a book series that I wrote, which is called Get Out of Your Head. When I was 17, I suffered my first panic attack. That was on a date with a girl that I was seeing, not necessarily dating, but we were hanging out, that sort of thing. Up to that point in my life, I felt as though that panic attack was one of the scariest things I had encountered. Didn't really know what was going on. My heart was racing. My mind was whirling. I was really struggling to keep it together in front of this girl, and I really could not speak coherent sentences as I'm having this panic attack. As it's going on, it became clear to me that the relationship that I was trying to build with her was not going in a good place. And then also that I was dealing with something on the mental health front, right? This anxiety. And then I guess I knew at the same time that I was like, okay, I don't exactly know what this all is, but I have some work to do, so to speak, to deal with my own struggles on the inside. I guess the difficulty, or one of the ironic things, is even though I made that recollection, or I drew that conclusion, I was 17 years old, didn't have a lot of good coping mechanisms on my side. And for that reason, I basically was just like, hey, that was too much to think about right now. And I just basically repressed or suppressed the entire experience. And I was like, I just pray that I never have a panic attack ever again. I'm sure most people could guess that, but I did have another one. So it was like 6 months later, right back in the same kind of place. I'm out with a different girl that I liked, having a panic attack in front of her. And this one didn't go so well, or neither went well, but this one went worse in the sense that this new girl had a few drinks in her. And I think the guard was down. And for that reason, she was shouting at me, swearing at me, calling me all sorts of names, being like, using a lot of swears and being like, why are you shaking? Why are you freaking out? Whatever. And so that was another really trying, really embarrassing ordeal, I guess, to say the least. Right. And so I woke up the next morning and it really hit me. I was like, I know I pushed that first panic attack down and decided not to deal with it, but I can't do that anymore. This is two significant experiences in a short while. So I was like, if I want to advance and succeed in my own life, especially when it comes to romance, I'm going to have to figure this all out. I'm going to have to figure out how to learn with my fretful mind. And so slowly but surely, I I began doing that. I don't want to romanticize it and say that it happened overnight, but I began that journey. So over the next 10 years, I read a lot of different books, a lot of different journal articles. I went to some therapy. I was trying to figure out what anxiety was, learn about my own psychology, and how to deal with anxiety. And essentially, I took all the different learnings and tactics that I had learned during that time and put them into practice. I was trying to experiment with them and figure out which of those tactics work best for me in terms of helping me calm myself down, get out of anxiety, that sort of thing. So eventually I turned around. I realized I had made some actual progress with my anxiety. And it was at that point that I felt as though I had a lot of stories. I had a lot of viewpoints that were helpful, and I wanted to turn around and share that with other people and help them with their own anxiety. So I started writing my first book that is on anxiety. Frustratingly, right as I was publishing that first manuscript, I fell into a depressive episode, and it was daunting because I was like, I felt as though I had the mental health thing figured out. I don't know, again, ironically enough, it was difficult to weather that storm, so to speak, but I knew that I had been through mental health challenges before, and I knew that something that was helpful for me was to learn a lot of new things on the topic, curate down tactics that were helpful for me and helped me manage my own condition, and then start writing about them and talking about them. So I had done that with anxiety before. One thing that will help me get through is to know that I can go on this same path of learning things about depression, implementing those things in my own life, and then trying to turn around and share that information with folks to help them on their own, in their own battles with depression. So I'm not going to sit here again and say that battle with depression was easy. It certainly wasn't. But I definitely feel like I needed to go through it, especially given the fact that when I told that story of being like, hey, I was about to publish my first manuscript and I thought I had everything figured out. I clearly didn't. And so this second battle definitely taught me more about the complex subject of mental health. And I think that was certainly something that I needed to go through and learn. And then also, I guess as a silver lining, it did help me write my second book, which is a book about helping folks manage depression. That's a blessing in disguise, I guess. And then, just to close it out, I basically say, I look back at all the daunting mental health trials throughout the last 10, 15 years, whatever it may be. And I'm like, a lot of those trials were very difficult. At the same time, however, they provided me a lot of know-how, and they also made me more empathetic to the challenges that similar folks go through all over the world. I'm still not a full-time author. I actually have a day job in software development, but I'm really grateful for the time that I'm able to spend writing, going on podcasts like these, and then also coaching folks with their mental health. It's one of the more rewarding things to be able to do. And part of it is just knowing, right? I know how bad it can be and how awful it can feel. So when I'm working with folks on their own mental health, I'm like, there's a motivation in me to be like, I want to not resolve, but I just want to help as much as I can because I know how difficult that can be. Sure.
If we go to the beginning of your story, the first panic attack you had is in the context of, sounds like somebody you're dating.
That's correct.
And same with the second one. So now I'm curious, like what was happening in those interactions looking back that brought that on?
Yeah. So the first one, probably a primer that would be helpful or important, is just the understanding of, on the first one, I was 17 years old, didn't have a lot of experience in the relationship department. So a lot of it was just nerves, and then also feeling as though a little bit of a fraud, if you will, being like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do in these situations. And because I had that doubt and that uncertainty as I'm in these situations, I'm just questioning myself the whole time, being like, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if my heart starts racing? What if I don't know what to say? What if she says something that I don't like? Whatever, right? So a lot of that was just inexperience breeding uncertainty, doubt, and therefore anxiety. The other piece was with that first girl was we had been on a couple dates, and then I started to, you can just pick up a little bit of a vibe sometimes, right? Where you're like, this person seems to be pulling away. And I was high school. I was trying not to read into things too much. It was like, everybody's got different friend groups and whatnot, but let's just see what happens here. So we didn't hang out for a few weeks. And then eventually she was like, hey, let's hang out again. And I was like, oh, this is great. But in the back of my mind was this gnawing question of, is she into this? Is she into me? What's going on here or whatever? I was still, I guess during that whole interaction, there was part of me that was like, I need to ask some questions here and get a little bit deeper. And asking those questions, the thought of asking those questions scares me, right? So I'm having this internal dialogue, internal narrative the whole time while we're like on this date. I'm basically distracted for most of it, right? Being like, okay, what do I say? How is she going to respond? So on and so forth. And so all of those things definitely bred a lot of the nerves that I was feeling in that situation, in that first situation.
Yeah. It sounds like it's super important to you to know what's going on and what to do about it.
It certainly is. Not to, I guess that's how my mind operates. So that when you say that, I'm like, yeah, of course, right? That's how else do you move forward in the world, right? If you don't have information and then know how to be able to process it and come up with a plan for yourself.
Mm-hmm. And so up to age 17, did it feel fairly easy to figure out what's going on and know what to do? And the opposite sex, the unknowing of the intricacies of an intimate relationship, is this the first time you feel you're in over your head?
Probably not the first time, but definitely a significant one. I think to the first part of your question, where for lack of a better way of putting it, I think the school system does give you that map where you're like, okay, I study, I get good grades. If I don't get a good grade, I got to figure out a way to get some extra credit or study harder the next time. And you almost have this path laid out for you where you're like, get the good grades, get into better classes, honors classes, AP classes, do well in those classes, apply to college, get into a good college. So really seeing that roadmap in front of me, and it just felt as though that is a pretty certain thing, right? It's for the most part, you put in the hours of studying, you learn the content, you're probably going to know the content and then you're going to do well on the exam. Whereas, yeah, certainly the way that you put it, Elle, of yeah, dealing with the opposite sex. And I'm not trying to make this out to be as if it was like this very unique situation. It was just unique for me at the time, right? And I was like, yeah, sure. This is very new. There's a lot of uncertainty here. I have not really ventured down this path too far. So there's a lot that I know, like I knew I had a lot to learn. And that's probably indicative of the manifestation of the nerves and the anxiety that I was feeling in that moment, not having that experience.
No one taught you how to date.
I don't know if anybody tells anybody how to date, but it's a tough thing, right? I think a lot of young folks go through that and we're like, hey, why didn't we learn this? But I don't know if anybody really does.
Tell me about, if you don't mind my going to your family, what had you been learning about relationships up to that point between men and women?
I honestly don't know if I had learned too much, to be honest. I have my mom, my dad, they've been together my whole life. And I don't know, a couple of my aunts and uncles split up, got divorced, but I never really dug too deep into that. I guess part of me was I didn't know if I wanted to know why they separated or anything like that. But I really do think I just didn't have a lot of understanding. I didn't know much about relationships at all, to be honest.
Curious with that. It sounds like you didn't know much about anxiety either.
Oh, I knew nothing about it.
Yeah. So it sounds like I guess I'm just curious, what types of things did your family talk about?
It was just fun stuff, right? We watched sports, talked about uh, going out to eat, going on vacation, having fun together, playing video games, stuff like
Mhm.
that. Nothing overly serious. Obviously, when it needed to be discussed, we would. But I think we tried to just have fun and enjoy each other's company.
Yeah. Because it sounds like this experience of having this succession of panic attacks opened up a door for you of realizing like, oh, I'm not just having panic attacks, I also struggle with anxiety just generally.
Oh,
And
most definitely.
heightened. So it makes me wonder, did the anxiety just start at these panic attacks or was it happening even before then?
I can definitely go back and see like the patterns in my mind, but I think also of looking at just what I did in my own life. There's no doubt about it, right? It's going to school dances always made me really nervous. And like the thought of having a track meet is like that always scared me, being like, I have to go to this competition, I have to put myself out there, I might not do well. Those things definitely wore at me for sure. But yeah, I didn't have the lexicon, I didn't have the labels. So I would just kind of say I was nervous. And I'd almost justify it by being like, of course I'm nervous, or of course I don't feel good. Who wants to go run 3 miles in the woods as fast as they can with no music or whatever it is, right? Yeah, some of it was definitely there. I think more so just these events of the panic attacks were really bringing that subject matter to the forefront and being like, okay, you have to deal with this now.
Yeah. I'm wondering who, when you were nervous about going to these events or feeling these ways prior to the panic attacks, who could you talk to about that?
So one of the difficulties for me was that I because I wasn't willing to almost admit it to myself, I therefore was not willing to admit it to anybody else. I did not really give myself the space to be able to talk to anybody about it. Eventually in college, I was just kind of not doing well, and my mom could sense that, and she'd be like, one day I remember her asking, she was like, what's going on? You seem really irritable, you seem not yourself, you seem on edge. And that was the first real conversation around this stuff began.
All the way till college.
Yeah, for sure. And again, I'm not trying to blame myself, but
Mhm.
I do acknowledge that like it was my choice to be like, hey, I don't want to confront this. And therefore, if I'm not dealing with it, I can't share it with anybody else, or I decided not to share it with anyone else. I couldn't give them the opportunity to talk about it with me.
Can I let me jump in for a second too? I like follow along Kristin's things. When you started out, Brian, like when you started out, even with us, like how were you feeling when you started out?
Today,
Yeah.
I mean, there was like, as I was reading my story, I think just, realizing that I had to jump from one thing to another. And as you're reading a story, right, you don't want to mess up or whatever. There was a hint of nerves there for a second, but I've done a lot of podcasts where like, I don't get anxious about this sort of thing very much anymore.
This is not, this is meant to be a kind thing that I'm noticing, not even
Sure.
judgmental. Like I noticed your pace was real fast.
Okay.
Pace was real fast. There was a point too where you were describing, like you even said, this was the scariest thing in my life. And as you were describing that, a smile came in over your mouth. And we don't really even know each other, but I'm noticing these things. And when you're interacting with Kristin, you were mentioning, I'm trying not to be judgmental over myself or blame myself, which I really like that idea because it's hard for me to imagine that no one else ever saw, no one else ever noticed this nervousness before. It's hard to imagine that it wasn't until college that somebody noticed you might be struggling. There might be some things that are hard that you're going through. And I get a sense that you're left all alone to figure these things out. And you're wanting to blame yourself for not being able to figure it out.
And not be able to reach out.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my fault that I didn't say anything. And so it's just curious to me, like, where did you learn I can't let people know that I'm having a hard time, that I have to power through and figure this out?
Yeah. I don't think that there was any one given moment, line in the sand of on this day, I
Mhm.
learned that. My hunch, which I could be wrong, my hunch is societal notions, the media, watching movies, TV shows, just picking up on the vibe that men are not supposed to talk about these things and have struggles and challenges.
And that was reinforced by the second date that you had, where you were mocked for having a really hard time.
Definitely.
Reinforced that belief.
Your mom eventually notices in college it's irritability that comes out. That makes me think, okay, maybe it was okay growing up to be irritable if things aren't going well. And you describe your family, we like to talk about happy things, we like to have a good time together. And I'm wondering, did you never see the transparency with your parents when they're going through something? Did you not see them be able to work through their own moments of they don't know what to do either? What was that like for you? What did you witness?
I would say somewhere in the middle where it was like, I certainly remember if a family member had passed away, like an aunt, I guess, great aunt or great uncle, maybe a grandparent. Like if my parents, there was a couple occasions where my dad had to give speeches and got very emotional. And it was So I definitely saw that piece of it, right? It's not like there was no emotion in the household, but it wasn't, I can definitely think of there are times where I guess with any parent, you have to, and maybe they're not consciously aware of where they're pulling the curtain or whatever, but life is hard. And so it's with any parent, you probably don't want to open the kimono all the way. And I think my parents did a good job of trying to. I remember one thing when the attacks of September 11th, and my mom was like, "Hey, we try to shelter you guys a bit from some of the challenges of the world, but you see these things in the news, like we can't hold that from you entirely." So I think there was definitely some understanding and then display of challenge, but there were also, I know of other things where it was like, I don't want to give up too much private details, right? But let's just say there was a financial struggle or whatever. Like maybe I didn't learn about some of those things until a little bit later in life. So yeah, somewhere in the middle of, I definitely, like when my grandmother got really sick when I was in late middle school, and my mom was really shaken up by that, and I experienced that emotion. So somewhere in the middle of, I learned some things about emotions, but I don't know, maybe the whole time I was just sitting there being like, maybe it's okay for other people to express, but I don't know if I feel comfortable expressing. I don't know, somewhere in the middle.
What do you make of that part, Brian, where I noted as you're describing these hard things that you're experiencing, what do you make of a smile come to your face?
Yeah, when you said it, I really do enjoy, maybe enjoy is the wrong word, but I am curious to get a read, because I don't know how I am perceived too much.
Yeah.
I think some of that is like the smile piece. There's probably two pieces. One is, I do think that I have white knuckled things in the past. I think just said push it down. Maybe not always on a push it down, repress it, never think about it again. I know I did use those words during my story, but there's been a lot of other things that I'm like, okay, throughout my life, difficulties, challenges that I'm like, let's work through this. Let's think about it as I've learned more and gotten more experience. So I don't know if there's that piece of, hey, I'm putting a smile on my face, white knuckling it, trying to just get through it. Some of it is also, understanding that like other folks will be listening, and I don't want to come on a podcast and make it sound like me having a panic attack is like the worst thing in the world, when folks who are listening will have gone through some horrific things. So sometimes I try to, I don't know what the right word is, but take the spotlight off myself a little bit to give space for folks. And I guess the last piece just being that I also like the speed there. I think one thing I need to do is just on like stage presence or whatever. Sometimes I'm like, if I talk really fast, I can get all my points in, and then people won't think that I'm just like boring.
Let me offer another. All of what you're saying, I do believe might have there. It might be true, but I also want to suggest too, like when you got to the part towards the end where you talked about the deeper meaning of this work for you, and it being that you can know how bad it feels and how difficult it can be. I had a sense that you're able to feel deep empathy and compassion for others. And I think for me, what I was curious about is the meaning I made of that smile as you described that difficult time. I was curious if you can feel empathy and care for that boy that was in that restaurant, or if you feel a sense of embarrassment of the boy at that restaurant.
I definitely think both are there. I have been on podcasts before, right, where I'm like, I look back and I think of, I don't know what the right word is, but trying to look at that scene in my mind, almost dissociating from it and looking at the 17-year-old boy, and being very sad and hurt for him, and just knowing that, again, even if it isn't the worst thing in the world, at that moment for me, that was hard. So I definitely have empathy for him, and it was difficult. I don't know if I would say that moment, like I think I've been through that moment in my head so many times that I don't know if I still have the embarrassment, but I do know that the possibility, the prospect of going through that again, I've gotten better with it, but there's still a fear sometimes of like, I wouldn't want to experience that again. And if it did, then I would be embarrassed today.
It's not okay for the adult you, for Brian today.
I wouldn't necessarily say that I thought that at that time it was okay. Like, I don't know. It's still a difficult thing. If you are in that situation and that happens, it's hard to be like, this is totally okay, unless like the person that you're with is you're safe, whatever the right word, like you don't have to worry about this. This isn't a big deal. But yeah, I don't know if I'd necessarily say it's, again, because it's hard and it's painful. I don't know if I'd say it's okay, but at least, I don't know, I've had enough time to think about it where I'm like, it happened and I just acknowledge that now, if that makes sense, where some of the emotion, maybe it's bled into other parts of my life. I don't know. But when I think about that situation, I'm like, it happened and we tried to make sense of it and that sort of thing.
I hear you doing a lot of work to minimize the impact of a panic attack. I've had panic attacks. They're terrifying. Who cares about other people's trauma in the midst of a panic attack? Like, that is a terrible feeling. You feel like you're going to die. And there's nothing that can convince you otherwise. That is horrific. And I can't stop thinking about that young 17-year-old you. Like, this was a life transforming experience. You're still talking about it 20 years later.
Yeah.
You've written books about it. You have dedicated parts of your life towards needing to make sense of this thing that happened. That's pretty significant.
It certainly is. There's no doubt about it. I acknowledge that I do sometimes minimize. I'm not intending to do that, even though that can happen. I think one of the things for me is that even though I want to make sense of it or things, I try not to stew on things too long, because I'm like, I know I reach a point of saturation where I rehash and eventually there's no more juice to be squeezed. Like, at least for me in my own processes, maybe with other folks having conversations like this one, there's more juice to be squeezed. But at least in my own running my own same patterns, I'm not getting anywhere.
I'm trying to think I've got this thought in my mind that I'm seeing this panic attack, and like your body seems to be wanting to tell a story. And a lot of the processing that's being done is not being done with the body. It's being done with the brain, which you come across to me, Brian, as like a brilliant guy.
Thanks.
And I can't help but think, is some of the path to healing meant to be through the impact to the body and letting the voice of the body come through, and not as much with the mind?
One thing that I guess as a follow-up, right, question is, what might something, like, I don't even know what that might look like. I do know that one thing that I really enjoy, because it helps me a lot on the mental health front, is running. Running for me is meditative. I would almost say it's at times a religious experience. I know that sounds ridiculous, but to me, you're out there and you're like, oh my God, everything aligns and everything makes sense for a few minutes. And so that's always been really great for me. Is that the sort of thing that you're referring to, Dennis, or maybe something different?
Definitely that embodied feel, like the way that you feel when you're in your body and you're connected to your body through that aspect of running. That sense is what I am speaking towards. Often, even as you're talking about, it's hard for me to really think too long. I wonder if it's hard for your body when you start to think that long too. I think Kristin or Elle I would want them to maybe speak to this embodiment component, because they've done a bit more research on it, and maybe they can bring better verbiage that would be helpful for all of us, including our listeners. But I really appreciate like how in tune you are even with us in this question and where you went with it.
For sure.
I have a question with the title of your book, Get Out of Your Head. Is that what it is?
Yes.
If you get out of your head, where do you go?
Present moment.
And what's it like for you when you get back to your body?
Almost a zen, if you will, right? Getting out of those loops in the mind, unshackling from the anxiety and the worry, just being at peace or immersed, like really focused on the here and now, enthralled in something that's engaging or fun.
So does your anxiety live in your head or does it live in your body?
Oh, it lives in my head. What do you think?
It's an interesting experience you're describing. On one hand, you have all these thoughts. Is she pulling away? Does she not like me? What should I do about this or this scenario? And then your body tells the truth of what you're going through with a panic attack.
For sure. Just trying to think of what that means, make sense of it.
So your body has a panic attack. It does pull you back into your body, right? You were in your head and now you're back to your body, but your body is doing things that you feel like you can't control that now. It's out of control.
Yep.
And in the moments where the panic attacks, eventually they pass, right?
Yes.
But when we're back in the body and we're not panicked, is there a sense of what was my body trying to tell me that I needed? What was going on for me at the time that I would have to get to that point of a panic attack?
Yeah. And is that rhetorical or is that for me?
Either one.
Yeah. I think it is a good rhetorical question if folks who are listening want to think about it. For me, going back to the earlier parts of the conversation, right? Just like feeling like a boy, feeling inexperienced, feeling not enough, feeling like worrying that, on some level, like I don't want to blow it out too far because I do think like, so what I was going to say was part of feeling not enough, feeling like I wouldn't be loved. But I didn't, even in that moment, I wasn't like, oh, this is making me feel like nobody in the world is ever going to love me. It was more with this person who I am desiring. I was like, okay, either I was afraid that things would go poorly with her. And then two, as this is playing out, I'm like, clearly, unless she turns around right now and is, I'm okay with all of this, then I don't think this relationship is going to go where I want it to go.
What if somebody had said, I'm okay with all of this?
That would have been cool.
How would that have changed your experience, though? How would that have changed this story?
I probably wouldn't have written a book about it. No, I do think it's something that I still am looking for. Somebody to be like, hey, like Brian has on some levels expressed who he is, right? He's written these books about anxiety, depression, things that he's dealt with. And I'm still okay with that. Like that, in order to have figured out at some point in my life, I'm like, I don't want to hide these things. Once I don't hide them, then it's the elephant in the room. And once it becomes the elephant in the room, somebody has to, I would hope, find a way to love me, either in spite of or even with those things, and maybe at worst tolerate them. But yeah, somebody was like, hey, I got you and we're all good. And you don't have to worry about this. I can't help but think that would have changed some of the trajectory of my life.
Absolutely.
If not all of it.
Yes. It's a fair ask. Can I be lovable and acceptable to people, even if I don't have everything figured out? And to not want to be alone in those moments is so relatable.
Yeah.
What's coming up for you in your body as we go there and we wonder about your body and what it's going through in moments where it doesn't know what to do?
Good question. There definitely has been times that we've been talking about this and I've been talking about, and the emotion, what is it, behind the throat or in the throat, kind of get that feeling of, there's been a couple times where I almost want to shed a tear, for sure.
Yeah. And if the tear had words, what would it say?
There's been a few different times where I felt that emotion. So I guess I'll just speak to one of them, which is something of, it's okay. Whatever the subject is, of whether we're talking about the panic attack, the not feeling loved, the suppressing how I'm feeling, whatever, just giving a big hug, that kind of thing.
Yeah. You're okay with us, how you show up today. Yeah. Thanks for being here. Thanks for showing up, bringing all of you.
Yeah, and thanks for having me. It's been very enlightening.
And that's where we end today. We are so glad you joined us. We want to invite you to get involved in the show. First, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. That way, you don't miss out on a future episode. If you're super curious, you can also find us on YouTube. Second, if you'd like to learn more about joining us and sharing your story, send us an email at phoenixeffectpodcast@gmail.com. That's phoenixeffectpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. This podcast and website represents the opinions of Elizabeth Key, Kristin Boskel-John, and Dennis Roberts, and their guests to the show and website. The content here should not be taken as medical or psychological advice. This content is for informational purposes only, and because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. The views and opinions expressed in the podcast and website are our own and do not represent that of our places of work. While we make every effort to ensure that the information we are sharing is accurate, we welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or website. In no way does listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content establish a therapist-client relationship.